Han Jiwa was a man who controlled Seoul's underworld with an iron grip. Politicians bent to his will. Police captains answered his calls. But the one thing he didn't have was a clue that his own execution had been scheduled for a Tuesday night inside his own mansion. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was supposed to be in Tokyo. But when he stepped through the doors of his luxury estate a day early, the silence was suffocating. He expected his wife Minju to greet him with wine and flattery. Instead, he found Sylvia, the young black maid, standing in the darkness of the grand hallway, her body trembling with urgency. She didn't scream. She didn't bow. She raised a single finger to her lips and whispered two words that saved his life. Stay silent. What Han Jiwa heard next from upstairs didn't just break his heart. It shattered his entire empire. The Seoul rain didn't just fall, it hammered against the pavement with a rhythmic, percussive violence that mirrored the throbbing behind Han Jiwa's temples. From the back seat of his Genesis G90, he watched the neon lights of Gangnam blur into long, distorted streaks of electric blue and poison violet. He was exhausted. The Tokyo negotiations had been a shark tank, but Jiwa was the apex predator. He had broken the Yakuza syndicate's resolve in record time, and now, all he craved was the sterile, expensive quiet of his estate. He was a man who lived by a clock of absolute control, orders given, results delivered, silence maintained. As the car glided up the winding driveway toward the monolith of glass and concrete he called home, Jiwa felt a rare flicker of anticipation. He hadn't called ahead. He pictured Minju's startled face, the glass of vintage Bordeaux she'd likely be holding, and the way her practiced smile would struggle to mask her surprise at his early return. He dismissed his driver with a sharp nod, stepping out into the deluge. The iron gates groaned shut behind him, a sound that usually signaled safety but tonight felt oddly like a lock clicking into place. He used his master key on the heavy oak service door, preferring the direct route through the mudroom to avoid the grandiosity of the front hall. The door swung inward on silent hinges. He paid a small fortune to ensure nothing in this house dared to creak. But as he stepped inside, the atmosphere hit him like a physical weight. The air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of expensive sandalwood and something sharper, like ozone before a strike. The mansion was dark. Not the soft, curated dimness of a home at rest, but a thick, swallowing blackness that felt intentional. Where was the evening staff? Where was the low hum of the central cooling system? Jiwa frowned, his hand instinctively ghosting toward the weighted grip of the firearm holstered at the small of his back. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who had survived 3 decades of street wars, his Italian leather shoes making no sound on the polished marble. He turned the corner toward the grand foyer and froze. A shadow detached itself from the gloom near the staircase. Jiwa's gun was out in a blur of motion, the muzzle leveled at the figure's chest. "Don't move," he hissed, his voice a low, lethal rumble. The figure stepped forward. It was Sylvia, the black maid. She was young, 24, smooth dark skin and wide, terrified eyes. She wore her gray maid's uniform, and she was clutching a feather duster in her hands. Her knuckles white with pressure. Her hair, normally pulled back in a neat bun, had come partially loose. She was trembling. He'd seen her 1,000 times, moving in the periphery, an invisible fixture of his luxury, but he had never truly seen her until now. Her dark eyes were wide, luminous with a terror so profound it gave him pause. She didn't scream. She didn't drop to her knees. Instead, she reached out, her fingers trembling as they touched his expensive wool lapel, and pressed a single finger to her lips. "Stay silent," she breathed, her voice so thin it was almost a ghost. Jiwa's finger stayed tense on the trigger, his mind racing between lethal distrust and a sudden, bone-chilling intrigue. In the heavy silence that followed, he heard it, a floorboard groaning directly above them, in the master suite. It was the sound of someone who wasn't hiding, because they thought the owner of the house was already dead. Jiwa's heart thudded against his ribs, a slow, heavy drumbeat of war. Sylvia didn't let go of his lapel. She guided him with a strength born of desperation, leading him up the service stairs that bypassed the grand foyer's creaking floorboards. He followed her, his mind a storm of cold calculations. He had built this empire on the corpses of those who underestimated him, yet here he was, being led through the shadows of his own home by a woman whose last name he had only learned from a payroll sheet. They reached the upper landing, pressing themselves into the velvet shadows outside the master suite. The double oak doors were slightly ajar, spilling a warm, amber glow onto the carpet, a mockery of the domestic peace he had expected. "The flight manifest is confirmed," a voice rumbled from within. It was Jin-ho. His right hand. The man who had sat at Jiwa's table for 15 years. The pressure-sensitive detonator is rigged to the landing gear. Once the wheels touch down at Incheon, Han Jiwa becomes a ghost of the past. A soft, sharp laugh followed, a sound Jiwa had once found charming. "And the rivals?" Minju asked. His wife's voice was devoid of the warmth she usually reserved for him. It was cold, sharp, and hungry. "The Park family will take the blame. I've already planted the digital trail. By the time the board meets tomorrow, I won't just be a grieving widow, I'll be the chairwoman of the Han Syndicate." Jiwa felt the air leave his lungs. It wasn't just a hit, it was an erasure. They weren't just killing him, they were stealing his life's work while he was still warm. He was always so careful, Jin-ho mused, the clink of ice against crystal punctuating his words. They were drinking Jiwa's private reserve. But he was blinded by his own shadow. He thought loyalty was a given. He didn't see that a throne is only as strong as the people holding it up. "He saw me as a trophy," Minju hissed, her shadow stretching across the hallway floor. "A beautiful accessory to his power. He never realized I was the one who kept the blades sharp. Now, I'll use them to cut him out entirely." Jiwa's grip tightened on his weapon until his knuckles ached. He wanted to burst through the doors, to let the lead fly until the room was silent once more. But Sylvia's hand found his wrist, her grip firm, her eyes pleading. She shook her head. Behind her, the digital clock on the hallway console flickered. If his plane was supposed to land in an hour, the hit squad would be arriving at the estate any minute to protect the new widow. He had 60 minutes of life left. Sylvia tugged his arm, signaling toward the service vent. The betrayal was complete, the ground had vanished beneath his feet. He took one last look at the sliver of light from the bedroom, the light of a life that no longer belonged to him, and retreated into the dark with the only person who hadn't sold his soul. They crouched within the narrow confines of the linen closet, the air thick with the scent of fresh starch and the heavy, metallic tang of Jiwa's adrenaline. He expected Sylvia to cower, but when he looked at her, the terror he'd seen in the foyer had crystallized into a cold, diamond-hard focus. She reached into the hidden pocket of her apron and pulled out a ruggedized tablet, the dim blue light illuminating a face that no longer looked like that of a servant. "I didn't just stumble onto this tonight, Mr. Han," she whispered, her voice steady and devoid of its previous tremor. "I've been tracking Jin-ho's offshore transfers for 3 weeks. I'm not just the help. Before I came to Seoul, I was an analyst for a private security firm in the States. I came here to disappear, but habits are hard to kill." She swiped across the screen, revealing a detailed architectural overlay of the estate. It wasn't the sanitized version Jiwa had seen during construction, it was a tactical map. Jin-ho has 12 mercenaries on the perimeter. 3 snipers on the north roof, 2 more by the main gates. They aren't your men. They're contractors from a splinter cell in Vladivostok. They don't want a conversation, they want a confirmation of death. Jiwa stared at the screen, his mind reeling. He had paid millions to the best security consultants in Asia to secure this perimeter, yet this woman had mapped every blind spot while buffing his floors. She pointed to a section of the basement, near the original foundation of the 1920s manor the house was built upon. "The main garage is a kill zone," Sylvia warned. "Jin-ho's men are waiting there for the emergency call. But there is a sealed coal cellar from the original structure. It connects to the old drainage system that leads to the Han River. It's not on your modern blueprints because it was walled off in the 50s. I found the access point behind the laundry machinery. Jiwo looked from the tablet to the woman holding it. For years, he had treated her as part of the furniture, a ghost in a gray dress. Now, she was the only person on Earth who knew how to save his life. His strategists had betrayed him with smiles on their faces, but the woman he had ignored was offering him a way out of the grave. Why tell me? Jiwa asked, his voice a low rasp. You could have let the bomb do its work and vanished. Because a man who pays for the funerals of his rivals' collateral damage has a code, she said, meeting his gaze. And because I'd rather take my chances with a lion than a snake like Jinho. Jiwa holstered his weapon. The traditional routes were a death sentence. To survive, he had to descend into the dark with a stranger. Lead the way, Sylvia, he said, and for the first time, he spoke her name not as a master, but as a man whose life was in her hands. The descent into the bowels of the estate felt like a journey into a past Han Jiwa had never bothered to acknowledge. Sylvia moved with a confidence that bordered on the supernatural, shifting a heavy laundry dryer to reveal a narrow, rusted iron door. Behind it lay a staircase of damp stone, leading down to a coal cellar that smelled of a century's worth of dust and forgotten labor. Jiwa, a man who had spent millions on smart home technology and biometric scanners, felt a jarring sense of displacement as they navigated the narrow, lightless veins of his own property. These were the paths of the invisible, the routes used by those who kept his world turning without ever being seen. They emerged at the edge of the service road, far from the polished gravel of the main drive. There, parked under a weeping willow, stood a silver 2015 Honda Civic. To Jiwa, it looked like a toy, a fragile tin can compared to his armored fleet. But as the distant roar of black SUVs signaled the discovery of their absence, that battered economy car became the most beautiful machine he had ever seen. Get in, Sylvia commanded, slamming the car into gear as Jiwa folded his tall frame into the cramped passenger seat. The escape was a blur of screeching tires and shattering glass. Two armored SUVs swerved onto the service road, their high beams blinding in the rearview mirror. Bullets pinged off the Honda's thin frame, a terrifying reminder that they lacked the Kevlar protection Jiwa took for granted. Sylvia drove like a woman possessed, her knuckles white as she veered the car into the labyrinthine back alleys of Seoul. She chose the narrowest capillaries of the city, lanes where the bulky SUVs were forced to scrape against brick walls, slowing their momentum. In the heart of an industrial district, the Honda's engine gave a sickening, metallic shudder. The dashboard lit up like a distress flare, and the car slowed to a crawl. No, no, not now, Sylvia whispered, her voice cracking as she pumped the gas. The car sputtered, the engine dying for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity. Jiwa reached for his weapon, watching the headlights of their pursuers round the corner. Then, with a desperate roar, the engine caught. Sylvia floored it, swinging the car through a gap between two shipping containers just as the mercenaries opened fire. They managed to lose the tail in the maze of a riverside construction site, but the victory was hollow. The fuel gauge was buried past empty, and the car finally died with a wheezing groan in front of an abandoned textile warehouse on the city's edge. As the silence of the outskirts settled around them, Jiwo looked at the dead car and then at the dark skyline of Seoul. Jinho's network was a web that spanned the entire city. Every camera, every port, and every street corner belonged to the man who wanted him dead. They were alive, but they were stranded in a world that had suddenly become a vast, open-air prison. The cold silence of the abandoned warehouse felt like a shroud. Jiwa sat in the passenger seat of the dead Honda, his breath hitching in his chest as the reality of his isolation took hold. For 20 years, he had been the sun around which the Seoul underworld orbited, but tonight, the sun had gone dark. He had no men, no fortress, and no wife. He had only a 9mm pistol with 2 magazines and a woman who had been a ghost in his hallway until 2 hours ago. There's nowhere left to hide, Mr. Han, Sylvia said, her voice cutting through the gloom. She wasn't looking at him, she was watching the entrance of the warehouse, her tablet still glowing in her lap. Jin-ho has your biometric data. He's pinging every cell tower in the district. We can't go to your captains, we don't know who's already taken the payout. Then what do you suggest? Jiwa asked, the rasp in his voice betraying a flicker of the desperation he had spent a lifetime concealing. Park Sung-ho, she stated. Jiwa let out a dry, mirthless laugh. You want me to walk into the dragon's den? Park has wanted my head on a pike since 2014. If I show up at his gates tonight, I'm saving Jin-ho the cost of a bullet. Park is a traditionalist, Sylvia countered, turning to him. Her eyes were sharp, analytical. He hates Jin-ho's lack of a code. More importantly, he hates being blindsided. If Jin-ho takes your territory, Park is next on the list. You aren't going to him as a beggar, Mr. Han. You're going to him as a warning. It was the hardest choice of his life, a gamble that required him to burn his pride to save his skin. Using the last of the Honda's dying battery to navigate, they stole a nondescript delivery van from a nearby lot and drove toward the Guro Industrial Complex, Park's iron-fisted territory. When they arrived, they were met not with words, but with a dozen assault rifles. Park's men swarmed the van before it even came to a full stop. Jiwa stepped out, his hands raised, the rain soaking through his ruined silk suit. He felt the cold sting of humiliation as he was shoved against the side of the van. I am here to speak with Don Park, Jiwa boomed, his voice reclaiming its steel despite the gun barrel pressed against his temple. Suddenly, a red light flickered on Sylvia's tablet. Sniper at 2 o'clock, she hissed, her voice low enough only for Jiwa to hear. And the gate guard is reaching for a silent alarm. They're being signaled from outside. Jin-ho's men followed us, Jiwa realized. Sylvia didn't panic. She identified a flaw in Park's defensive perimeter, a gap in the lighting near the loading docks. If we don't move now, the ambush will take out Park's men too, she shouted to the guards. Her sudden tactical authority stalled the execution. Using her tablet, she jammed the gate's frequency, creating a chaotic window of time that allowed Jiwa to push past the lead guard and stand in the light of the factory's main bay. Park Sung-ho emerged from the shadows, a silver-haired shark in a tailored coat. He looked at Jiwa's tattered state and smirked. The king of Seoul looks like a drowned rat. I have a traitor in my house, Park, Jiwa said, ignoring the insult. And if you don't help me cut him out tonight, he'll be in yours by morning. I'm offering you the northern docks. Just give me the chance to burn the traitors alive. Park's eyes flickered to Sylvia, then back to Jiwa. He saw the truth in the desperation. The docks? You're bleeding, Jiwa. I want the docks and the river routes. Done, Jiwa whispered. The price was his empire, but the reward was his life. The midnight air at the Incheon docks tasted of salt, diesel, and the iron tang of impending violence. Beneath the skeletal silhouettes of towering gantry cranes, Han Jiwa stood face to face with Park Sung-ho. The two men were bookends of a dying era, one battered and bleeding, the other pristine and predatory. Around them, the black water of the Yellow Sea lapped against the concrete pilings like a countdown. I've spent a decade trying to take your northern territory, Jiwa, Park said, his voice cutting through the fog. He traced a finger over a tactical map spread across the hood of a black sedan. I didn't think I'd get it because you were too tired to watch your own back. Jiwa didn't flinch. The humiliation was a dull roar in the back of his mind, but it was secondary to the cold clarity of survival. Jin-ho isn't just an ambitious lieutenant, Park. He's a parasite. He's already made overtures to the Triad syndicates. If he consolidates my men, he won't negotiate with you. He'll erase you. Park's eyes narrowed. He signaled to one of his men, who brought forward a ceremonial blade. I've watched that boy, Jin-ho. He has the hunger of a dog that hasn't been fed, but no respect for the leash. I suspected he was moving behind your back, but I didn't realize he had convinced your wife to hold the knife. In the grim silence that followed, they performed the old rites. A shallow cut across the palm, a press of skin to skin, a blood oath that bound their fates until the traitors were cold. Jiwa watched his own blood mingle with his rivals, a physical manifestation of the power shift. He was no longer the sole king of Seoul. He was a man buying a second chance with the soil of his ancestors. The northern docks, the river transit routes, and the Payu warehouses, Jiwa stated, his voice a hollow baritone. They are yours. In exchange, I want your heavy hitters and a clean channel into my own security network. From the shadows of a nearby shipping container, Sylvia watched the transaction with a clinical eye. She saw the map being redrawn, half of Jiwa's empire vanishing with a few strokes of a pen. She saw the way Jiwa's jaw set, the pride of a lion being carved away to save the heart. Together, they mapped the counterstrike. They would let the world believe the bomb on the jet had done its work. They would let Jin-ho and Min-ju bask in the glow of their stolen crown. The charity gala scheduled for the following night, originally intended as a celebration of the new merger, would now serve as the stage for a resurrection. You're playing a dangerous game, Vidi, Park noted, using Jiwa's old street name. You're coming back as a ghost. A ghost is the only thing a traitor should fear, Jiwa replied. He looked over at Sylvia, her silent presence a reminder that the old ways of ruling through solitary fear were dead. To reclaim his throne, he would have to learn a new kind of power, one built on the intelligence of those he had once deemed invisible. Returning to the Han estate was like walking back into the mouth of a predator that had already tasted blood. Sylvia slipped through the service entrance at 5 a.m., her breath hitching as the familiar scent of expensive sandalwood and floor wax hit her. To the mercenaries patrolling the perimeter, she was just a ghost in a gray dress, a non-entity returning to polish the silver of a dead man. Jin-ho's paranoia was focused on the horizon, watching for rival syndicates, never suspecting that the greatest threat to his new kingdom was currently vacuuming the rug beneath his feet. The weight of the signal jammer in her apron pocket felt like a lead brick against her thigh. Every time a guard walked past, their combat boots thudding on the marble, Sylvia lowered her head, her movements becoming robotic and subservient. It was a dangerous masquerade. She moved through the corridors with practiced invisibility, her eyes darting toward the ceiling-mounted cameras she had already begun to reroute using a handheld bypass hidden inside a cleaning rag. In the cramped, sweltering heat of the servants' quarters, she found her opening. While the house was distracted by the frantic preparations for Min-ju's Unity Gala, Sylvia accessed the main security hub through a localized port in the laundry room, a terminal Jin-ho's tech team had deemed too low priority to encrypt heavily. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, jagged rhythm that she had to manually suppress. One mistyped command, one lingering glance from a passing sentry, and she would be a loose end buried in the garden. Through the basement windows, she watched the catering trucks arrive. These weren't the usual high-end vendors. Among the crates of vintage champagne and trays of Wagyu beef were reinforced canisters marked as Industrial CO2 for the bar. Inside those canisters, Park Sung-ho's men had dismantled and stowed the ceramic composite firearms that would bypass the mansion's metal detectors. Sylvia watched from the shadows of the pantry as the supplies were moved into the heart of the home. By mid-afternoon, Sylvia stood in the center of the grand ballroom, a feather duster in one hand and a hidden transmitter in the other. She did a final mental sweep of the grid. The cameras were looped, the emergency exits were remotely unlocked, and the blackout virus was resting in the server's memory like a dormant predator. Min-ju walked past her, draped in morning silk and barking orders about the flower arrangements, her eyes sliding right over Sylvia as if she were a piece of the architecture. Sylvia didn't flinch. She simply adjusted her apron and moved to the next vase. Tomorrow, the world would learn that the most dangerous person in the house wasn't the man with the gun or the woman with the title. It was the woman who saw everything because no one bothered to look at her. The Unity Gala was a masterclass in deception. Beneath the shimmering crystal chandeliers of the Han ballroom, Seoul's elite moved in a sea of silk and expensive cologne. Min-ju stood at the center of the room, her morning black replaced by a regal, triumphant gold. She played the part of the grieving successor with haunting perfection, her hand resting lightly on Jin-ho's arm. Jin-ho, dressed in a tuxedo that felt like a coronation suit, scanned the room with the smug satisfaction of a man who had successfully killed a god. To them, the silence of the night meant their bomb had detonated over the sea. At the edge of the room, Sylvia stood near the service entrance, a silver tray in her hands. She caught the eye of a catering captain, one of Park's men, and gave a subtle nod. Suddenly, the music died. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the ballroom didn't just open, they were thrown wide with a violence that sent a shiver through the crowd. The conversation evaporated into a vacuum of shock. Han Jiwa stepped into the light. He was a vision of resurrected fury, his sharp jawline set and his intense eyes locked on the stage. He wore a black suit that seemed to absorb the room's light, and as he walked, the black and gray tattoos on his hands flexed like a warning. He wasn't alone. Flanking him was Park Sung-ho and a phalanx of men whose presence signaled a seismic shift in the city's power. Minju's glass hit the marble floor, shattering like her composure. Her face drained of color until she looked like a corpse herself. Jin-ho's hand jerked toward his waistband, but he froze as dozens of red laser dots blossomed across his chest, dancing over his heart like blood-red stars. "I hear my funeral was scheduled for tonight," Jiwa's voice boomed, a low, lethal rumble that filled every corner of the hall. He didn't look at the guests, he looked at the traitors. "It's a pity. I hate to miss a party in my honor." He stepped onto the dais, his presence dwarfing them. With a flick of his wrist, the giant monitors behind the stage flickered to life, displaying the evidence Sylvia had meticulously harvested: offshore bank transfers, encrypted messages plotting the flight's sabotage, and audio recordings of their intimate betrayals. The room erupted in a low, horrified murmur as the crime elite realized the depth of the treachery. "You traded loyalty for a ghost of power," Jiwa said, his voice cold enough to freeze the air. He turned to Park Sung-ho. "He is yours. A man who breaks a blood oath deserves no mercy from his own kind." As Park's men dragged a screaming Jin-ho into the shadows, Jiwa turned to Minju. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't raise his voice. He simply took the jade pendant from her neck, the one he had bought as a peace offering, and dropped it to the floor. "You leave with what you brought to this marriage, nothing." He signaled to the guards, who seized her by the arms and dragged her toward the service exit, casting her out into the same torrential rain Jiwa had survived. The room understood. The old king had returned, but he was no longer alone. He turned his gaze toward the back of the room, finding Sylvia in the shadows. The alliance was sealed, a new, more dangerous order had begun. 6 months had passed since the rain-soaked night the Han Syndicate nearly bled out in its own foyer. Tonight, the air atop the Latte World Tower was crisp, smelling of expensive champagne and the cold, sharp scent of power. Han Jiwa stood at the center of the glass-walled ballroom, the moonlight catching the silver at his temples and the dark ink on his hands. He looked every bit the restored king, but his gaze was no longer heavy with the weary isolation of the past. He was waiting for the one person who had seen the man behind the tattoos when the rest of the world only saw a target. The double doors opened, and a collective hush rippled through the room, a silence born of pure, unadulterated shock. Sylvia Davis stepped into the light, and for the first time, the invisible maid was the only thing anyone could see. She was breathtaking in a gown of deep emerald silk that flowed like liquid around her, a striking contrast to her smooth, dark skin. Her hair was swept back in a sophisticated style that revealed a diamond choker at her throat, a gift from Jiwa, but more than that, a declaration of her status. She moved with a grace that was no longer subservient, but sovereign. As she approached the center of the room, Jiwa did something that made the city's most hardened power brokers freeze. He didn't wait for her, he walked toward her. He didn't give an order, he offered his arm. When he turned to face the crowd, his voice carried the weight of a new era. "Gentlemen, colleagues," he began, his hand resting firmly over hers. "I would like to introduce you to the architect of the Han Syndicate's future. My strategic advisor and underboss, Sylvia Davis." The room erupted in a low, frantic whispering. To the elite, she was an impossibility, a woman from nowhere, of no lineage, suddenly holding the keys to the kingdom. A bold reporter, sensing the story of the decade, pushed through the crowd. "Ms. Davis," he stammered, "the world has never heard your name until tonight. Who are you, really?" Sylvia leaned in slightly, a mysterious, knowing smile playing on her lips. "I'm the woman who made sure he came home alive," she said softly, her voice carrying an authority that brooked no further questions. The night ended as it had begun, high above the city, but with a different foundation. Han Jiwa and Sylvia stood together on the private balcony, silhouetted against the sprawling, neon-lit skyline of Seoul. They were no longer master and servant, nor were they solitary predators. They were partners, forged in the fires of a betrayal that had intended to burn them both. Jiwa looked out over the city he once ruled alone and realized that true power wasn't found in a crown or a bloodline, it was found in the eyes of the person who stayed when the world went dark. The cleaning was finally finished, and for the first time, the king and his queen were looking at a horizon they had built together.